Good afternoon, and thanks, Donna, for that perfect segue into the project that we're doing with you. Okay. So I'm going to start off by just bringing a bit of context about the reef and the challenges we face. We all, of course, know about all of the impacts impacting the reef, but I also wanted to say a little bit about how we tend to explain the net decline in reef health according to the usual suspects of bleaching, cyclones, and crown of thorns. And some work that we've been doing just recently is showing that's not the whole story, as you might expect. And just for the purposes of anyone who is tweeting part of this talk, the next few slides, we're not allowed to tweet them until tomorrow for some reason. The paper comes out tomorrow. But this is what we've been looking at. We've been taking the AIMS long-term monitoring data from the mid and outer shelf reefs and asking questions about recovery rate. Because if you look at the trajectory of a reef, of course, you have a recovery period punctuated by a series of disturbances. And the question we asked was, what's happening to recovery? Is recovery continuing the same way, or is it changing? And this is a study that's just about to come out. And when we look at this for a variety of different coral groups, we were really surprised to see the trend of recovery rate declining by an average of 80% since 1992 across the reef. And that applies to each of the main coral groups we've looked at. And the y-axis here is the instantaneous growth rate of recovery. Now, one of the things to bear in mind with this is it's very patchy. There's 90 reefs that have been monitored. It's very variable from reef to reef. Some reefs have shown no change at all in recovery, others a really drastic change. So this has really got us even more concerned. And of course it tells us that some of these trends that we're seeing aren't just about these big impacts. There's something eating away at the underlying resilience of these reefs and their ability to bounce back. It is, as I said, spatially variable. And we don't know a lot about the causes because we've only been able to do statistical analysis of it so far. But what it suggests is that we do see the strongest association with water quality. Those years where there's major flooding, we see the slowest recovery associated with that. And there's also legacy effects. So if you have a year where you have an exceptionally strong cyclone impact, although that might reduce the coral cover further, it also reduces recovery rate in addition. And that might be just because it's producing even more fragmented rubble, for example. And these are issues that restoration can try and address. And the question we ask, of course, and many other people are asking, is what can be done to facilitate natural recovery? Because often it's the recovery process that the management can intervene with. And one of the other science things that's been going on, as Donna's alluded to, is looking at questions of connectivity and is there a system-wide ability of the reef to recover? What is the recovery process? What does it look like? And some work that we did late last year that Karlo presented a little late yesterday was asking the question of how is the reef connected from a coral perspective? So to do that, we look at the connectivity networks, the larval dispersal from reef to reef, and we ask which are the reefs that are most important at driving connectivity. And so we have a number of criteria. We want to find reefs that are strongly connected to other reefs, lots of other reefs. But we only want to value those connections if they're persistent in time. A lot of them are very variable, of course, as you might expect. So what are the reefs that are consistently connected to one another? And ideally, if you have reefs that are strongly connected to other reefs, that are also strongly connected to many other reefs, you're going to maximize the scope for having a sort of cascading effect of stimulating recovery. And when we did that analysis, we found that 540 odd reefs met those criteria. That's 14% of the reefs on the GPR. Now, we then did some additional analysis. We looked at, well, what happens if you then asked the question about what's the situation after major bleaching events. We applied a very severe criterion here, which is that we only looked at reefs that had never yet experienced major bleaching, including the most recent events. And when you do that, of course, that cuts down the number of reefs considerably. And then lastly, we asked, Well, you want these reefs to be good sources of coral connectivity, but not good sources of crown-of-thorns starfish. So then we knocked out those reefs that we know are important in the spread of crown-of-thorns starfish. And when you do all of that, you ended up with this very small number of reefs left that are really ideally positioned post the average bleaching event to kickstart recovery. And that's a small number, 3% of the reefs, 112. They run the length of the reef, but it's very patchy and mostly in the south. But the interesting thing is that if you only looked at those 3% of the reefs, they are connected, at least in principle, to almost half of all of the reefs within a single spawning event in December, November, December. So there's a really massive scope there for recovery to start occurring. And that was the sort of, well, to me at least, somewhat good news, in that there is a very highly connected system. So what? Well, it tells us that 14% of these reefs are really important sources of coral larvae relative to the reefs around them. And that's something that management can work with. So it means that there is scope for less threatened reefs to help kickstart recovery, which is some systemic resilience. But overall, it highlights this great heterogeneity in the importance of reefs. And that, of course, is what's motivated all of these efforts to say, so what can we diagnose about these reefs? Which is why Donna's looking at this fortunate reefs concept. And we can capitalize upon this for resilience-based management. So you might ask, well, what is resilience-based management? It's another catchphrase. Do we need another catchphrase? No. All it is it's management directed to protect or enhance natural processes of resilience. And so it's founded on an understanding of the system in the same way that a doctor would only really try to intervene in a patient by understanding how the patient's natural system works. You're trying to work with the system and facilitate it and protect it where you can. And it doesn't necessarily change the types of things you do, but it might give you a different strategy for what you do, where you do it, and when you do it. So it's more of a kind of strategic to try and get the most efficient outcomes. So a project that we have funded under the current NEST round is trying to develop a prototype that's going to be not just a prototype small scale, but actually a decision-making tool to help us do that. And just to give you an example of what this might look like, imagine that you have a bunch of reefs of different state at any given time. So some of these reefs in red are really healthy, the ones in blue have just been damaged and have got very low coral populations. And they're connected, and some of them are in really good environments for coral growth, others less so. When you've modeled that system, you can introduce your variety of exposure layers. So the sort of work that Donna just presented is really helpful because it pulls together a lot of really advanced, well, the best we have now, exposure layers for the kinds of processes the reefs experience. But then our job is to then integrate that with models of how the system works to make predictions as to what will happen in future. And you might run it for, say, 5 years' time and ask, well, what's going to happen? And some of these reefs will start to show some recovery, you might predict, but there might be a chance of a cyclone or a bleaching event, and when that happens, you end up with some of these reefs getting knocked back, and the net outcome might be, well, on average, only one of those reefs increased its status, which wasn't particularly great for a 5-year period. But then you can go back and ask, well, what if you were to do some interventions now? What if you were to protect some of the processes on these reefs and stabilize rubble and accelerate the recovery process on other reefs? And then you rerun your scenario and you see, well, what does that give you in the end? And it might be, in this case, that you had a net improvement over that previous intervention, of no intervention. So this is a way of taking the science that we have and enabling to sort of project what might the consequences be of this kind of management strategy, which we haven't been able to do in the past. And so the strategy for this is to start off with a map of what is the current state of the reef. What are the situations of these reefs? Some of them don't need any interventions right now, others might need various kinds of interventions. And then to add information on the social value, the economic value of certain reefs, are they highly important, medium, low importance? And then to connect them, and this is where the science comes in, and it's taking the models of the systems, and my team have been developing models of these ecosystems for about 8 years and testing them against long-term data. We've looked at the connectivity, We had a project funded by the Great Barrier Reef Foundation last year, where we worked closely with our colleagues on the eReefs team to try and link these models so that they could take account of some of that wealth of information in eReefs to make predictions and of course include the connectivity. And then what you want to do is be able to have a drop-down menu, if you like, of intervention types and understand, well, if you do certain interventions, what actually changes? How does the reef respond to that? So you could go into the system and then choose a set of interventions and play out the scenario there. And there's different ways you could do that. You could either do it in a very exploratory way and say, well, all right, this reef is damaged, we might do a restorative activity here. This reef seems to be in a really good shape at the moment. We might add some additional protection there for the next 2 years, and so forth. And then compare the different outputs. Or you might ask the computer to try and optimize something for you, and you might say, well, we would like to see this outcome in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Find us a combination of tools that would get us there. And if you were too ambitious, of course, the computer would give you a blue screen of death and say, forget it. But it will help you sort of gauge what might be achieved versus what can't be achieved. And what you might expect to do is to sort of try your different intervention strategies and gauge, how much does this improve things? What does the distribution of reef state look like in future? How many of your socially or economically important reefs are at the good or very good level? And we haven't got to the point yet, this is an early stage of the project, to define exactly what these final outputs would be. Of course, it's really important we get the decision options right, and this is obviously going to be led by Gabrumpa. And we need to evaluate what are the appropriate interventions for each type of reef, but also what do these interventions actually achieve? Because we often make assumptions about what they achieve, but we need to actually codify that so we're all clear about what assumptions we're making about how our management improves the reef. And there's a whole variety of tools that we would be working on collectively. And this is a very collaborative effort, as you would imagine. So there's a variety of agencies involved in the management side of it. There's the usual suspects contributing to the science. There'll be some pilot implementation, probably in the Cairns area, in addition to a GBRF project. We're engaging with citizens of the GBR to see if we can expand the acquisition of data on reef state. Because that's critical to get this right. You really want information on as many reefs as possible, even if that information is as simple as, look, it's just been damaged, it's showing some early signs of recovery, it's a reef that's dominated by plating corals already. Very simple categories, but very informative in this process. It's designed to support the RIMREP process, and it links with a variety of other activities and projects. So Donna just talked about the Fortunate Reefs project. So whereas what we can do is then take many of those data layers from Fortunate Reefs and then formally integrate them with models to project how management might change things in the future. There's ties to other NESP projects. It's very important that we work closely with the COTS Integrated Pest Management Project, which we are working with. We have a project also funded by NESP identifying what are the most important species to help maintain the system functioning. And that's a project that involves huge numbers of scientists from Queensland. And it links to the RRAP project. So the next steps of this, as I said, we only started in January, so we're at a fairly early stage of this 3-year investment. Our next steps are to really get a clear understanding by all the players of what do our interventions on the reef achieve. Science tells us something, managers will add to that considerably. We're exploring a development of a rapid reef assessment tool that would be complementary to the whole host of other programs out there to get information on the reef. But the motivation here is very simple information. The sort of information that you would get by putting your mask on, looking underwater and saying, okay, this reef has just been hit by something, or this reef is already showing a lot of recovery. And what are we going to be delivering from this? Well, the idea is to develop a standalone software tool that will do all of this. It will have crunched the last 8 years or so of data from eReefs, from our connectivity work, from our ecological models, and we'll put all of that at somebody's fingertips so that you can ask these sorts of questions of the reef, well, I would say today, but next year. So it's going to be a practical tool that will be used, but we don't expect this to become the only tool that is ever developed for this system. I think what I really can think of here is this is a mutual learning experience, and that in the longer term, there will likely be something that supersedes this, probably created under RIMREP, that then takes live inputs from a variety of monitoring programs and things that continually updates the state of the reefs. But then we need something like what we're developing to use that information and convert that into a tool that allows you to say, if you do this, this is what's going to happen, roughly speaking. So we're going to learn a lot of lessons by doing this that will then help build maybe the sort of gold standard into the future. So just briefly then, reefs vary hugely in their ecological importance and their exposure to damage. And this is key because this is something that we can work with in our management. This is a collaborative program. I'm not a big fan of giving talks about projects that are only starting. That's why I crowbarred a bit of science into the early part. But it will, I think, inform restoration strategies in terms of where that can plug in. And we're very happy to engage with other partners. And this is the list of the sorts of partners who are involved at this point.